and had a chance to meet some colleagues at Amnesty International Peru. And I think most of us are aware of the recent political situation, the reforms that have been happening that have really had a tremendous impact on some of the organizations we support at Interparis, but all of the organizations and civil society movements in the country. There's been really this chilling effect on and shrinking of civic space. So I'm very pleased that Daniela is here with us today. Daniela Soberón is an advocacy officer at Amnesty International Peru. She's a lawyer. She has her master's degree in environment and development from the University of Edinburgh, and her focus is on uh, environmental justice, human rights advocacy, conservation, environmental governance, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So very pleased to hear from you, Daniela, and then after a presentation, we'll have a chance to have a Q&A session. So I'll pass it along to you. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before starting, I would like to know, oh yeah, I do have permits for sharing my screen, I think. Just give me 1 second so I can put this on. Is it already shared? I think so, right? Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for opening this space today. As Naset said, I'm Daniela Soberón, Advocacy Officer at Amnesty International Peru. Today was supposed to join also Vanessa Cuentas, which is the advocacy coordinator of the office. She's sending her apologies because of personal reasons. She won't be able to join, or probably she will join for the Q&A, but for the presentation, it will be myself. From Amnesty International, we appreciate the interest of the Americas Policy Group in understanding furtherly the current situation in Peru regarding the recent changes to APSI law, which I will explain later on, no worries. And well, we will share today the Amnesty International's Peru analysis of the amendments to the APSI framework. This framework itself, which refers to the international cooperation framework, presents serious risks for Peru's civic space and unduly restricts the rights to freedom of association, freedom of expression, and access to justice. And this is just a little bit of the context. While the law is framed as an effort to strengthen APSI, which is this cooperation system, in practice, it expands discretionary state control over the work of civil society organizations. This is deeply problematic, especially in a context where civic space has already been shrinking and where organizations working on human rights, environment, feminist agendas, and indigenous rights have often faced stigmatization. So, to begin with a brief contextual reminder about what is APSI. What am I talking about when I say this? This is the Peruvian Agency for International Cooperation, and it's the agency responsible for managing and articulating non-reimbursable international cooperation. Some timeline about this, it was created in 2002 with the stated objective of coordinating international development assistance and ensuring its alignment with national priorities. But also, I want to also add another layer of context before focusing on what has been happening in Peru, is that Peru is not an exception. In fact, we are talking about that around the world, Amnesty International has been documenting a growing trend of restrictive regulatory frameworks targeting civil society organizations. Governments are increasingly using narratives around transparency, sovereignty, national security, or the fight against illicit financing to justify tighter control over NGOs. We have seen similar patterns in countries such as Russia, Hungary, and in our own region, El Salvador as well, where regulatory reforms have been used to restrict civil space, limit access to international cooperation, and increase state discretion over the work of civil society. It is within this broader context that Peru, over the past 2 years, has experienced a significant shift in the regulatory framework governing international cooperation. Now, back to the timeline. Throughout 2023 and 2024, several bills were introduced seeking to modify this framework of APSI, specifically the founding law. In March 2025, Congress approved the reform to the law itself, and this was not only approved under the radar, but it was turned into a public event because in April, the executive held a public signing ceremony at the presidential palace, turning it into a political act. During this event, even the president explicitly stated that these changes were necessary to counter NGOs that, in her words, were allegedly acting against the country's interest, sowing hatred and attacking the system. So this is what was behind this kind of reform. And then in September 2025, the executive approved the regulation implementing finally this reform. This was this year. These reforms at the end changed how NGOs and civil society organizations can access, receive, and use international cooperation funds, which is in some cases the main source of financial stability for a lot of these organizations. So a little bit about what changed in the new regulation. Which amendments are we talking about? Well, the new APSI framework introduces several key modifications that materially affect the operating environment of civil society. We'll focus only on some, but there are a lot of tiny details going around this whole framework and the reform itself. But first of all, we're talking about a mandatory registration for all organizations receiving international cooperation funds, regardless of their type, size, or area of work. Previously, this registration was optional and mainly served to access certain tax benefits. For example, Amnesty International Peru was not registered under the previous framework, but now has been required to register and assume this new level of state supervision. Second, now there are compulsory submission and approval of operational plans, activities, contracts, and other type of instruments. Any activity implemented without prior approval may constitute a serious infraction, which is pretty concerning itself. Third, a strict prohibition on the use of funds to support any type of action. I will bring more details about in the next slide, but any type of action against the state, whether if it's administrative, judicial, or international level. This primarily exposes those who assume legal representation of organizations, potentially even leading to criminal charges against them. This could function as a prior censorship or an intimidating mechanism, leading fewer and fewer people to take on such a role for fear of reprisals. And in fourth place, we're also talking about this infraction system that has been implemented. One type of infraction is the fines that are like a huge amount of money, which is not proportional to the amount of money which some tiny organizations, NGOs, use as a budget. So this could lead to the closure of some organizations which work with a smaller budget. It is important to note that the language of the whole reform is really open, it's broad, it's concise, granting discretion to the official, which finally is going to take the decision of the registration, for example, and also when analyzing what type of actions are we talking about when we are saying about these actions against the state. And this could mean in the worst case scenarios, shadow reports, for example, could present as a type of action. We don't know. We have a lot of uncertainty about what actions against the state means. And well, the motivations behind this reform are what I mentioned before. According to the authorities, what they have shared in different statements is they want to protect the sovereignty, preventing political interference by NGOs through more transparency and accountability, ensuring that these NGOs align with the state priorities. But however, as I'll explain next, the practical impact of the law and its regulation goes far beyond these stated objectives. And now, what are the concerns about this new reform system and the new measures that have been implemented and that are being implemented through this change in the regulation? From Amnesty International, we have these concerns, but also I will share with you some concerns about specific topics. First, these general concerns. Um, First, the one about these actions against the state, because we really don't know what this means, what it covers. This could severely restrict access to justice, especially for communities, for example, and individuals who depend on civil organization support um, for planning this type of actions and to navigate legal processes, for example, including victims of state repression, communities facing environmental contamination, women's and girls seeking justice for gender-based violence, indigenous people defending their territories, and families, for example, in Peruvian history specifically, families of victims of enforced disappearance or extrajudicial executions. Uh, so these general concerns also raise significant specific concerns regarding freedom of expression and freedom of association. For example, it could directly impact and affect independent investigative journalism, independent press. Many investigative and research media outlets in Peru rely heavily on international cooperation to sustain their work, particularly on corruption cases, for example. By requiring organizations to submit detailed plans, contracts, activities, the reform could grant authorities access to sensitive editorial information, for example, exposing potentially sources, storylines, or whistleblowers, and ultimately undermining the protection of journalist sources, which is a cornerstone of press freedom. It has also consequences for indigenous organizations, specifically, many of which depend on non-reimbursable international cooperation to defend their collective rights. This includes pursuing the right to free, prior, and informed consultation, for example, supporting land titling processes, monitoring environmental impacts, and documenting rights violations. Increased discretion, intrusive oversight, or the threat of sanctions could significantly restrict their ability to carry out these essential activities. Well, the remaining concerns relate to the severity of sanctions, specifically considering the broad discretionary power created by the vague legal concepts and the extensive ex post control over the information submitted by civil society organizations. Together, these measures create strong incentives for false censorship, for example, and may limit independent monitoring, scrutiny, and accountability, all current functions traditionally fulfilled by civil society organizations. So now, what are organizations doing with this situation? Well, Peruvian civil society are trying to mobilize and adapt multiple strategies, which is really hard considering this broad framework. First, some organizations have filed amparo actions before the judiciary, well, the system, arguing that the APSI reform violates freedoms of expression, freedom of association, and the right to access justice. Amparo actions are these constitutional procedures. And these cases may eventually reach the Constitutional Court, but it is potentially an issue as well because the current political context and the court's recent decisions in the last couple of years have tended to favor executive and congressional power over probably fundamental rights. So even if this is a path, it also does not secure the respect and the guarantee of freedom of expression or the non-application of the APSI reform regulation. And as a complementary measure, organizations are between their own system and their own the way they are working, they are trying to rely also on their own workers as independents, as individuals, for example, in the cases of legal support. So they want to avoid disrupting of essential human rights and these processes that maybe they are already supporting. And they are trying to rely on the workers as independent people, but this is also risky and it's full of uncertainty on what will the consequences be of this type of decisions as well. So um, just a way of closing, because I know we'll have kind of a discussion after and maybe talk about this further. We wanted to share with you that the implications of this reform extend beyond Peru as well, as we have shared that this is a regional and a global kind of trend. But um, what it reflects is this trend of using of shrinking civic space and restrict and control civil society and their narratives of transparency, order, or sovereignty. For this reason, the kind of international solidarity and monitoring are essential. And I think that will be it from my side. But in case you have any type of question, any kind of precision, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for that um, concise and very thorough overview of what's going on. I have a lot of questions, as I'm sure my colleagues do.